Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. For those of you new to the series, Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights advocates for human rights issues and pursues strategic litigation to hold governments accountable at home and around the world. Our book club is a virtual gathering that gives you access to social justice activists, authors, and journalists like the ones you'll meet today. Please feel free to post questions in the comment section in Zoom or on social media throughout the conversation, and we'll answer them as time permits. Founded in 1980 with the proceeds from Arthur M. Schlesinger Jr.'s best-selling biography, Robert Kennedy and His Times, the RFK Book Award is presented to the book that, as Schlesinger said, most faithfully and forcefully reflects Robert Kennedy's purposes, his concern for the poor and powerless, his struggle for honest and even-handed justice, his conviction that a decent society must assure all young people a fair chance, and his faith that a free democracy can act to remedy disparities of power and opportunity. This year, unable to choose just one recipient of the award, the judging panel singled out A Fever in the Heartland, the Ku Klux Klan's plot to take over America and the women who stopped them, for special recognition. Tim Egan's riveting narrative pulls you in as he outlines how a narcissistic con man used hate and division for personal, financial, and political gain, becoming one of the most powerful villains of the 1920s, only for his greed to bring about his downfall. We welcome Tim Egan and one of our outstanding RFK Book Award judges, Annette GordonReed, American historian and law professor. Annette is the Carl M. Loeb University Professor at Howard Law School. She has won 16 book prizes, including the Pulitzer Prize in History in 2009 and the National Book Award in 2008. A renowned law professor and scholar of American history, she has taught at New York Law School and Rutgers University. Her many honors include a MacArthur Fellowship, a Conmen Center Fellowship, a Guggenheim Fellowship, and a National Humanities Medal. She has also been a longtime member of the RFK Book Award judging panel. Please join me in welcoming Annette GordonReed.
Thank you very much for that introduction. I'm very happy to be here today and it's to talk about this very interesting book by Timothy Egan, who is a renowned journalist who has won numerous awards, including a Pulitzer Prize as a journalist with a team for New York Times journalists writing about race in America. And he won the National Book Award for his book, The Worst Hard Time, in 2006. And now he's tackled another difficult topic with this book, A Fever in the Heartland, the Ku Klux Klan's plot to take over America and the woman who stopped him. I have to say, I first heard this story when I was at Dartmouth College in a history class, and I thought it was the most lurid and awful thing that I had ever encountered. And then I just kind of put it out of my mind. And so this year, when we were going back over it again, it brought all of those memories back. I mean, for people who don't know this story, could you just give us an overview, a quick overview of Stephenson and Oberholtzer and what the book is about?
Yeah, sure. Just one second, though. I just want to thank you all for hosting me. And I want to say what a great honor it is for me to be a small part of honoring the legacy of a man who was always been one of my political heroes, and a man whose influence continues to be felt in all the better angels, as Lincoln said, of our nature. So thanks for hosting me and thanks for letting me a part of this. So I'm sort of an accidental historian in that I stumble upon these stories every now and then. I rub my eyes and I can't believe that I've found something that is relatively unknown. I like to think I know my history pretty well, but Harry Truman said something that most people don't know. He said, the only thing new in the world is the history we do not know. And I've been traveling all over the country for the last year, and most people say, this is a history I did not know. That exactly 100 years ago this year, in fact, this fall, this country was nearly taken over by its oldest domestic terror group. And I'll just give you sort of a rough outline. The Klan of the 1920s was the second iteration of the Klan. The first one was largely destroyed thanks to President Grant in the early 1870s. Then it reappears 50 years later in the Jazz Age at a peak of immigration, at a peak of Jim Crow being locked down in the South, at a peak of a lot of social turmoil because prohibition is going on. Women have just been given the right to vote. There's a lot going on in the country. They have 6 million members who put their hand on a Bible and swore to, quote, forever uphold white supremacy. They have 75 members of Congress who they count as followers. They have at least 3 elected governors in 1924, elected governors as open Klansmen. And mind you, they're not in the South. They're in Oregon. They're in Colorado, and they're in the place where my story takes place, the Heartland in Indiana, where they elect a Klan governor, a Klan mayor in Indianapolis. All 9 members of Congress are Klansmen, and 1 in 3 white males in the state of Indiana is a sworn Klansman. This is what the situation is in 1924. And behind all this is a powerful, demagogic con man, a man who's sort of drifted from town to town. And then in the early 20s, he seizes on hate as a way to have power and wealth. So that's the setting. The Klan is at the peak of its power. They're run by one man who's sort of a Wizard of Oz-like figure. As time goes on, he appears less and less. He has a lot of secrets. He's a sexual psychopath. He's an alcoholic who raises for temperance. He talks about the virtues of women, but he violates women. He lies 5 ways from Sunday before the sun rises. He has a powerful network of misinformation people, his personal Klux. He has his own private police force. All of this is in the American heartland, and it sort of echoes, strains that run through our history. So this is a history I knew nothing about, and it just blew me away the more I stirred this pot and looked at it.
So how did he, you said he sort of drifted from place to place. How does a drifter, he's originally from Texas, I believe, and how does he end up there? And how does he get this misinformation, disinformation, what do you want to call it? I mean, how does a person just show up and become
first of all, you have to
thing that he did?
Yeah, that's a great question. But first of all, you have to the context. The North was ripe, especially Indiana, for the Klan in the 1920s. Remember the social turmoil. We'd never had so much immigration in our country before. And there were immigrants who, quote, didn't look like the earlier immigrants. There were a lot of Southern Europeans. There were a lot of Jews from Eastern Europe. And there was a huge backlash to this, that somehow these people could never become Americans. We'd had a record amount of immigrants.
So that's an interesting point. The people who are coming today, they're not coming from south of the border. It's the kind of immigrants, the people that are assimilated today, and the kind of people who are generally, accepted as Americans. But this is a different group of people, and they excite the same amount of fear and hatred.
Well, and because a lot of them are Jews, the dominant clans, the Klan are sworn white Protestants, and they want a state religion of white Protestantism. Jews can never be white Protestants just by their nature. So there's that. The other thing is this, again, the social turmoil. Women have been given the vote, but more interestingly, they're socially liberated. Remember, this is the era of flappers. So
cutting their hair.
Yeah, like my grandmother was like, she used to tell stories about being a flapper and going to the roadhouse at the edge of town and drinking bathtub gin and dancing to black jazz till 2 a.m. This freaks them out because it's a huge revulsion against Victorian morals and hearth and home and all of that. The other thing is the Great Migration is going on. Blacks are moving from the South to the North, to fleeing Jim Crow to a place where they think there will be no Jim Crow. So all of this makes it ripe for a drifter to roll into town. So this guy is a traveling salesman. He's a charmer. He says things that people like. And he sees this one little item in the newspaper about the Klan going to a Protestant church on Sunday and giving a bribe to the pastor. And they say, this is for the things you are doing to help us. And he has this sort of idea that, my God, if I can co-opt religion, if I can sanctify this new Klan, I can help it grow. So he sees this way to plant Klan groups. And ultimately, in a very short time, every county, there's 92 counties in Indiana, every county but 2 has a Klan den. And then he expands it to women. There's a Klan's women's auxiliary. Remember, these are white males, but he wants women to be involved. He wants the family to be involved. Within a few years, there's several million women in the Klan, in the women's auxiliary, not the formal. And then worst of all, he founds the Ku Klux Kiddies, which is children 8, 9, 10, 11 years old who put on their little hoods and go into dens and learn how to hate their fellow Americans. And again, this is what's so incongruent about this. All of this happens in a place we think of in this Norman Rockwellian ideal world, make America great era, which it truly wasn't. But I'm sorry, I'm not really answering your question. He was a very DC Stephenson.
No, you are answering the question, because I mean, it's so important to think of the context in which this person arrives. I mean, if it had been without the kind of social upheaval that you're talking about and the destabilization of the society as they had known it, it might have been, he might not have had fertile ground for this kind of, to pull this off. I mean, it's still surprising. I mean, I think this will surprise readers, the extent to which he was able to be successful, because you'd think that, spreading a message of hate and getting people riled up in that fashion would not get so many people involved. But if religion is a part of it, and concern about family and social mores, that's enough to do it. It's just it's surprising. I mean,
Well, also, and it's hate coded in Americana.
Yeah.
So they had these lemonade stands outside of where Ku Klux kiddies would recruit. They had, barbershop quartets singing racist songs, but they looked so prototypically American. They gave out toys to orphans at Christmas. They, would have big displays of fireworks after a baseball game. They had their own baseball team, by the way, too.
What's more Americana than that, right?
Right, exactly. And then they would burn a cross. So this whole thing was coded in the superficial parts of Americana.
Yeah. So the other surprising thing about it, well, I guess I could ask the question. I mean, as a journalist, where was the Fourth Estate in all of this at the point? I mean, you would think, and might be wrong, but that there would be watchdogs. People would be looking at this and saying, if not in Indiana, I mean, other places, to say what is going on here, and how did that not make any inroads, or did people were just sort of totally absorbed by the misinformation and not listening to people? What were journalists doing at this point, or even other religious figures?
Well, this knocked off a lot of my, long-held beliefs about Americans' guardrails. And it's hard for me to say this. The press completely failed in this regard. Most of the institutions failed. The Klan had lawyers on their rolls. The Klan had judges on their rolls. The Klan had cops on their rolls. The Klan had newspaper editors. There's a section in the book where this reporter says to another reporter, "Why don't you come with me now? We're going to go down and join the Klan." He says, "Why are you going to join the Klan?" He says, "Because everyone's joining the Klan. If you don't do it, you'll be an outsider." Now, there was a brave editor, and he's highlighted in this book, named George Dale from Muncie, Indiana. Saw what these guys were up to right away, and he banner headlines in his little independent newspaper: "We're becoming a Klan republic. They're taking over Indiana." And they beat the crap out of him. They hauled him before a Klan judge, and they put him in a penal farm without even a trial. I mean, where's the Constitution in that? This is in the North, again, in Muncie, Indiana. So this brave newspaper editor did crusade against him, and the net result was he got locked up. And his fellow reporters didn't necessarily come to his defense. Most of the press in Indiana was complicit in this, in that they just saw it as, well, the majority's for it, and we don't want to upset the majority, and so they kind of went along, and many of them were Klansmen. Now, there were outsiders. The New York Times talked about, and the Chicago Tribune talked about the state of Indiana becoming a Klan republic. So there were, and there was this newspaper called Tolerance that was founded by Blacks, Jews, and Irishmen. And they would dox these Klansmen. They would print these lists of 10,000 members at a time to show people. The thing was called Who's Who in Bed Sheets. And it was trying to shame them. But you know what happened? It had the opposite effect. Instead of shaming people, people read this list of all these Klansmen. They said, "Wow, I better join. Look who's on this list." There's the guy who delivers my milk. There's the merchant who sells me my stuff. There's the pastor down the street who runs the church. So yeah, the press largely failed with a few exceptions. And in some cases, they tried and didn't get anywhere.
So looking at this, you were saying that it gave you a different view of American guardrails. Would you say that that is the biggest surprise? When you write a book and you go into doing these topics, you find out stuff that you are surprised by. What was that the biggest surprise? What surprised you the most about the research that you
Well,
did?
and I'm not sure I really answered this in the book. It really troubled me the whole way. How can seemingly average people who go to church every Sunday and worship a God whose principal admonition is to love your neighbor as yourself turn to abject hate to the point of putting their hand on that same Bible and swearing that hate? How does that process happen? That's what I tried to answer. And secondly, and this is what really disappoints me, how do we get so suckered into following a con man? This guy they all followed and worshiped, this D.C. Stephenson, this grand dragon of the largest Klan operation on the history of the planet, was a total fraud, a total fraud. But he said things that people wanted to hear. He gave them a reason to blame others for their troubles. It wasn't your fault that it's failing. It's these Jews coming in. It's not your fault that, things are going bad for you. It's all these outside forces. So I don't think I totally answered that question of how seemingly average people, it goes to the psychology, the duality of human beings, I guess, on the surface, seemingly nice, but just below that. And remember, this is a really important point. Though they were a Mayberry Klan, as I call them, they firebombed people's houses. They chased an entire population of Black people out of a small town in Indiana on 12 hours notice. Told them all to get the hell out or they'd burn them out. They lynched 3 men in Indiana in what is the last known lynching in the North during all the period of lynching. They committed horrible things. They would have huge meetings in downtown Indianapolis at lunch where speakers would get up and would call Jews un-American parasites and say, we're going to run them all out of town. And people cheered. So on the surface, they were kind of benign, but at their core, they were terror. There was a terror group, which is what the Klan has always been.
So those kinds of things were a surprise to you. What lesson are we what we to draw from all of this, though? I mean, it doesn't sound like a good advertisement for democracy. I mean, for the people as the ultimate arbiters of society in ways, right? I mean, these movements, was this what was driving them? Thinking of themselves, a conception of themselves as the people and having the right to do these kinds of things. We typically think of them as, or hope that they will be doing things that are according, as you said, to the better angels of our nature. But, sometimes the majority rule is not, they make bad choices.
And the majority rule in this case knew exactly what they were doing. Because the Klan sent out at election time these ballots saying, here's who you're going to vote for. And it was a Klan slate, and everybody knew exactly what they were voting for. And the majority put them in power. When they elected their Klan governor, after the Grand Dragon said, here's our guy, they didn't think, oh God, we're being fooled. This is some kind of a dupe thing. They knew damn well they were voting for a Klansman. When Colorado elected a Klan governor in that same year, 1924, 100 years ago this fall, you know what his motto was? Every man under the Capitol dome a Klansman. And then once he was elected, he tried to fire all Jews, Blacks, and Catholics from working in state government. So they knew what they were doing. They knew what they were doing. Now, lessons. 2 things I would say. You write about history because you think it's deeply. 2 reasons. I write about history because I'm looking for a good story. I am a storyteller. And
those are the best stories.
You look for it and you say, oh my God, I can't believe this is happening. And this is a great story. But 2, you do it because it's resonant. It could teach us something about ourselves. You don't just do, oh, that was them. No, it shows a strain that goes through modern life that's there. And I would say that what this story shows is, again, all the institutions failed. Press, judiciary, certainly the ministry, which they were signed on, the Protestant ministry, the University of Notre Dame was the institutional barrier, and they had a famous riot where they routed these Klansmen, but ultimately they failed as well. The lesson here was one person can make a difference. And that's why the subtitle of my book is "And the Woman Who Stopped Them."
Yes.
And this was a woman named Madge Oberholtzer,
Mm-hmm.
and she was a product of her time. She was a young 20-something, went to Butler College, was feisty, independent, kind of a flapper. I mean, cut her hair short in a bob and
Mm-hmm.
go to the clubs, and wasn't really political, but she had a job with the state. And when that job with the state was on the line, she had to go to the guy who runs the state, the Grand Dragon, to save it. And I don't want to spoil the story,
Mm-hmm.
but a horrible thing happens to her, an
Mm-hmm.
absolutely violent, horrible murders. Remember, this Grand Dragon, the guy that everybody worshipped, as his power went on, he became ever more evil. I mean, he was a rapist. He cannibalized some of these women. He was a horrible human being, which most people didn't know initially. But it was up to Madge Oberholtzer, this one woman, whose words outlived her. I am spoiling the story a little bit. Her words from the grave, brave words when she was on her deathbed, ultimately brought this guy down. So that lesson is, yes, it's a cliche, but it's true. One person standing up can make a difference when the guardrails, when the institutions fail us.
Yeah. So that's a lesson, but it's a tough lesson,
It
right?
is. It really is.
Because I mean, this person has to be sacrificed. The person had to be larger than life when there were people who should have known better. One question I do want to ask before he gets to be total Mr. Evil, as you're reading about him, as you're trying to figure out who he was and discovering him, do you see what the source of his appeal was? Now, a lot of people might tell people what they want to hear, but there's nothing that clicks. I mean, was there anything about him that you were able to discern as to why it was, he who could pull this off as opposed to other people? I mean, con men, first they say that you can't con an honest person. Now, a lot of these people want to believe these things, and there's all larceny in the blood or whatever they want to call it.
Right.
But the person usually has something that's appealing. What if anything was appealing about him, or is it just that you're able to discern that from the 1920s? Is there's even looking at from that perspective, what would have been attractive about him other than the message? And even the message, as I said, would not have resonated if the messenger didn't have a talent.
Yeah, and just to give you some sense, again, that's a great question. It goes to the core psychology of not just him, but us. What prompts a huge percentage of Americans to buy into an awful man? But before I answer, let me just give you one little anecdote. On the 4th of July, 1923, he appears, this Grand Dragon, before the largest gathering of the Ku Klux Klan in the history of the world. 200,000 people show up in their white sheets in Kokomo, Indiana. I had to go there for this book and research it and look out on this prairie and imagine this assemblage of 200,000 people on our nation's birthday. He drops out of the sky in a single biplane with KKK lettering underneath the plane. And he circles and circles, and they go, there he is, there he is. And the plane lands, he gets out with his purple robe, the Grand Dragon purple robe, and people bow to the ground like he's Jesus Christ. And his top aide says cynically, if he'd told them to flap their arms and try to fly, they all would have flapped their arms and tried to fly. And so they worship this guy. He is an Oz-like figure. Persona he projects is this wonderful man. He called himself the old man, even though he was only 34 years old. And he projects this thing. But here's my theory to your question. Yeah, he said things people wanted to hear, of course. He played to their fears, of course. He blamed others, all the social forces, for wrong, and you're on the side of right against this wrong. But here's the other thing. This is just my theory. A person who has no shame, a person who has no bottom, a person who's willing to go there is powerful. And here's the proof of that. So he sexually attacked many women. And in one of these cases, just before what happened with Madge Oberholtzer, he assaulted this woman in a hotel in Columbus, Ohio, tried to rape her, attacked her, bloodied her. and he was jailed. The
Mhm.
cops were called. He was arrested. Now, usually he had the cops on his side. A lot of the cops were Klansmen. Um, you know, Malcolm X famously said that a lot of Klansmen just changed their robes for a badge.
Mhm.
Well, in the 20s, that's literally what happened.
Mhm.
But he was jailed.
Mhm.
And the story got out that this Grand Dragon had been arrested for savaging this woman. Did it change their view of him? No, because he then got out of it and no charges. He got the charges brought, etc. And it showed again, he had no shame. And I think that gave him a power that people in the darker side of their hearts admired. I know on the surface that doesn't make sense, maybe,
Mhm.
but that was his superpower. He was willing to go there.
He was willing to do things that sort of the
Yep.
Walter Mitty-like people in their own lives would say,
Exactly.
would sort of like professional wrestling. If I could
Exactly
do
right.
that, I could do this, and we could all pretend that this is real. We know it's not, but he's willing to act it out. And
Right. And here's the proof of it. In the last 2 years of his reign, he would go around and tell everyone, I am the law. That was his phrase that was used in the trial. He'd say, I am the law. That's why the law can't touch him. So he was sort of admitting that nothing can stop me. I will go there. He said, I am the law. I alone am the law. And he sort of proved it for much of his public life, getting away with these, just horrible crimes against women.
such an amazing story. And as I said, I heard about this in college, and it stuck with me. But this part of it, now that we've been through some of the things we've been through, it's such a fragile thing. A republic, a democracy, a society, just in general, it depends upon people following rules and guardrails, attending to guardrails. And the idea of having a person who says, I am the law. And you think about Tom Paine, who famously said about America, in America, the law is king, meaning it was something other than, not a person. It
Right.
was the concept of the law. And this just seems like such a perversion. I mean, that's what surprises me about the book. Well, it surprises me that such a perversion of what we typically think of as the American story, the American ethos, that you just wonder how people fell for that.
Yeah. And there was a guy, I failed to mention him, a prosecutor. Now this DC Stephenson, this Klansman, had most of the prosecutors on his side. He truly was the law. And there's a scene in the book where I have a dinner just after the election, and it's a horseshoe-shaped table in Indianapolis, and they all go around taking their turn. Prosecutor, judge, sheriff, chief of police, all the law themselves, and they pledge loyalty to this head of a terror group. And they say, I will make no decisions without your permission. There was one exception to that. And it was a sort of a chuckle-headed little guy, who'd been a war veteran, and he was a mainstream Republican who didn't buy into it, he ends up being the prosecutor. But again, I'm sorry it comes down to one individual or one or two individuals. You would think, and you mentioned this, and it's how I felt, that democracy really is a fragile thing. Democracy is something that's stable and steady until it's broken and shattered. And then when it's broken and shattered, you say, how the hell did that happen? I thought we had these things in place. So take away Madge Oberholtzer, the woman who basically gave her life to bring this guy down. Take away this one prosecutor, and this guy is on his way to the White House. Now, you laugh at this. I'll tell you why you shouldn't laugh at this. In 1924, again, the same year all this happens, 100 years ago right now, the Democrats and the Republicans held their national conventions. And what did Time magazine put on the cover that week of the conventions? The head of the Ku Klux Klan. And they wrote a largely favorable story saying that no group had been more influential at both the Democrat and Republican conventions than the Klan. They couldn't even pass a resolution condemning the Klan at either of these conventions. So remember, 75 members of Congress, 4 elected governors, a handful of senators, and they were going to run possibly Stephenson for the White House in 1928. So take away those two, the path there is going forward. They had 6 million people in 24. They're on their way to having 20 million Klansmen in 1928.
Mm-hmm. So did they differentiate? How did they differentiate themselves, or did they, from the old version of the Klan? Or did they try, or did they just, I mean, because you would think that Time Magazine, all of these other reputable institutions would remember that there was a Klan
Right.
that was pretty, reviled and had to be put down, as you said, by the Grant administration of the South Carolina and the hearings and so forth. Did they differentiate themselves? Are we a new improved Klan, or
Right.
what?
The new improved Klan did in fact do that. They would have these pitches where they say, we don't do lynchings anymore. We don't burn down buildings. We're all about mainstream America. Of course, unless you're a white Protestant, you can't join us, but we're still all about mainstream America. They really did differentiate themselves, and they tried to. Here's another thing that's an important context. This is the age of men's fellowship groups.
Mhm.
The Elks, the Oddfellows, all these groups where people, mostly benign, would have these meetings and the secret handshakes and the secret language, and mostly just like-minded people who would have, dress up and play at fellowship. One of the things that Stephenson did was model the new Klan after these fellowship societies.
Mhm.
So it's pretty cool to belong. And they ultimately became the largest fraternal organization in the United States, far more than the Elks, far more than the Oddfellows. And he sort of modeled them after that. And there was also a power to one of your earlier questions about belonging
Yeah.
and belonging to an invisible empire, as they called themselves. They were all one under the sheets. They were anonymous. Remember, anonymous.
Yeah.
You weren't supposed to you took this oath never to out the name of a clan. So there's certain power in belonging to this organization that you saw as ascendant and invisible. But yeah, they certainly try to differentiate themselves in their public musings. But in what they did, in fact, in California, they went after Asians primarily.
Yeah.
One of the obscure facts I found in Utah, they went after Mormons. So, I mean, sort of, it was like anyone who was sort of an other, they really expanded their enemies list. It used to be blacks. The Klan was born of hatred of African Americans. The fact that 1 in 3 Americans in the South, were formerly enslaved was what was the foundation of the new Klan. But they greatly expanded their range of hatreds in the 20s. So it was sort of an all-purpose hate group.
Catholics. I mean,
Yeah,
that was the
Catholics,
primary time.
Jews, immigrants, Asians, anyone who was an other. And it was, believe me, this is a question we're struggling with right now. Who's an American? What's an American? Is this a tribal identity? Is it a religious identity, or is it an idea? And that's what they played on.
Yeah, yeah. And that's beset us from the very beginning, and we're in that place now. I mean, speaking of now, do people in Indiana know this history? I mean, you go there, you went there. What is I grew up in Texas, and we took Texas history 3 times in K through 12. And we learned a lot about Texas history. Some things were in, some things were out. But I just wonder, do Indianians know how many of their grandparents and great grandparents and other people who lived there were part of the Klan?
Yeah, another great question. By the way, I'm working on a book about Texas right now that's about the Buffalo Soldiers in the 1880s.
Yeah.
Who were basically, 1 in 5 members of the cavalry were Buffalo Soldiers, and so they were vanguard. Yeah, that's a great question. I have been to Indiana, I think 5 times since the book came out, and I'm going there in the fall. This is one of the positive things. It's been hugely gratifying how people in Indiana have received this book. They didn't know this history.
They
This
didn't.
was, at the time this happened, this was front page news everywhere. And it was well known, it was not in the least bit a secret. The Scopes monkey trial was going on about the same time the evolution trial, just down the road in Kentucky. But the trial of the Klansmen was riveting the nation. And it was a big, big deal. The fact that, they called it a Klan republic, that 1 in 3 members, white males, belonged to the Klan, was well known. But then it fell into the mists of history, and they disappeared it. They put it in the American memory hole, and they erased it. And the representation of that was physical. 20 years ago, somebody found a chest in a barn, and they opened up the chest, and this was in Noblesville, Indiana, where the trial took place. place that were 1 in 3 members were Klansmen. And inside that chest was the names of all the people who belonged to the Klan. It was a roster.
Mhm.
And everyone was like, holy shit, there's my grandpa. Oh my God. And they're like, suddenly there was this huge revelation that their kin was Klan.
Mhm.
And you know what they did? They closed the chest. And and they said no access to it. They only recently, in the last few years, have allowed people like me to look at what was in the chest.
Uh-huh.
They sort
Have
of
they been
struck.
protesting about that though? Have
Yeah,
people?
they did. They did.
Yeah.
And it was a big, well, do we not want to know our history? Are we afraid of our history? So when I go to Indiana, I've had huge crowds. It's unbelievable. I went to Kokomo, where that 200,000 people showed up. So there's a large segment of the population that is now, not just because of my thing, but I don't want to take
Yeah.
credit. They just want to know the truth.
Oh no, I think you're absolutely right. In writing about Jefferson and Virginia and Texas and so forth, and I originally thought when I went to visit there that there was going to be a lot of hostility toward, but people come out, most ordinary people want to know the history,
Right.
even if it's painful, they want to know it, and because I think they want to understand how are we the way we are now, because it's clearly. That can't just be disappeared. I mean, we're saying 100 years. 100 years is nothing
It is.
in the
Right.
blink of an eye. It's just the blink of the eye of history.
Well,
So,
they're our grandparents or our great
yeah,
grandparents.
yeah, the people that we knew, the people helped form us. And so it can't be that world is completely gone. The echoes of that are still there. And I think people want to know.
Right. It's funny you said that. I shouldn't admit this. I was actually afraid the first time. I did a lot of research there, but then the book comes out. And it just doesn't really make Indiana look very good, of course.
Mm-hmm.
I was afraid to go there and I had, oh no, your readings are sold out. And we had 1,000 people in a church in Irvington.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm reading in Evansville where the Klan planted its, first chapter of the North. And I was afraid. I was physically afraid that something would happen to me, that they would, attack me. And it was just the opposite, as you said. And that's because, just as you said, we should not be afraid of our history. It's not, you can incorporate the good with the bad and still feel good about America.
Mm-hmm.
It's not a one-dimensional, it's not just a straight look at one way or the other. History is complicated, as are human beings.
Yeah, yeah. No, that's been the answer that people have given, and I've come to realize that it isn't just one or the other. People want the entire picture, and you can still look at Indiana, look at that, and say that was a bad chapter, but it's a
Right.
lesson for why we don't want to do this again.
Yeah.
And this
No,
is how it was done. These are the tools that this person used. It was an individual, and we should have paid more attention to that individual. I mean, there are lessons to be learned from this. That's the history is by itself interesting. I mean, I love it whether I learn lessons specifically or not, but you very often do, because you said before, these are things that recur in history, in different places. They show up. Demagoguery, the cult of personality, people who may know better but nevertheless want to be part of the group and go along with terrible things.
Well, it's funny now is that you can't find anyone who will openly say, yeah, Grandpa was in the Klan. I mean, they did completely erase this. Yeah, and you also touched on something. I did want this to be a little bit of a roadmap for how to recognize people like this, a little bit of a tutorial that you could see, oh, there's the commonalities. Because again, this is a vein that runs through our history. I wrote a book about the Irish called The Immortal Irishman. They were the first subject of anti-immigration fever, and they passed these laws, the Know Nothing Party in the 1850s, make it impossible for Irish immigrants to become citizens. So you see this stuff. It's a vein in our history. It just pops, gets above the surface and goes underground, then gets above the surface and goes underground.
Well, that's why it's the American experiment, the idea of having a country, a republic that's based upon, as you said, an idea, as opposed to, a blood or a national religion, a national race. I mean, there's some people who want it. I mean, people miss those things. Some people want that. That's never been what this is. And it couldn't have been what this is, because everybody who came here, all the people who came here, whether Africans brought over or people who came voluntarily, came from some other place. And they were all different. and different religions, different beliefs, and you try to make a country out of a declaration, out of a constitution, and to say, if you believe these things, then you can be an American if you live by this. And there's some people who just don't want to accept that. They want blood and soil. And that keeps bubbling up in Indiana and other places nationally. And we're always fighting that, trying to fight that down.
Well, very well put. I just, that's exactly what I would have said.
Yeah. So
it's still, by the way, it's still an ongoing experiment. I mean, don't think we resolve this one way or the other. I mean, it's still a big struggle.
Oh, I agree with you. I think part of the problem that we're having now, it seems so strange that a lot of the polarization, the contention comes out of this idea. There's a question, are people who are not European, who are not white, are they really Americans? Are they truly Americans? Even African Americans who've been here forever. There's an argument that, well, maybe they're not really. They were not a part of the people for purposes of the original founding, and they shouldn't be today. So, yeah, this is something that's with us and contentious, and has been from the very start. Was it depressing for you to write? How did you?
Well, there was one other thing look, I had to do this during COVID and spend all this time in Indiana thinking about but it was such a good story. And I had so many holy cow moments. One more thing I didn't mention, they were really into eugenics at this time.
Oh, yeah.
Too. This was a big feature, not just of the Klan. The president of Stanford was a big eugenicist.
Oh, no, that was huge.
Yeah, there were academics, guys with PhDs who would promote this idea that, well, if you look at the skull, the forehead of a Southern European, he's clearly of an inferior person because they would take measurements of the skull and judge some postmortem, judge intelligence by this. I thought one of the ironies, as soon as Stephenson was finally booked into jail, one of the first things they did was take a measurement of his skull, because that's what they did with all criminals, to try to see if there was a common skull size. But eugenics was a big deal, and the Klan preached it. And they said, one of the things they talked about, the mongrelization, that, if there's too much intermarriage, which was outlawed, by the way, in most of the states until the 1960s, basically, this is the great fear and again, I never bring up Nazi analogies because I think it kills all conversation. But I will say this for the record, when the Nazis started their eugenics program and tried to create a master race, they claim that they looked to the state of Indiana, which passed the nation's first involuntary sterilization law, as they voluntarily sterilized people who were learning disabled, alcoholic, women who were promiscuous, a whole range of things that would qualify you for never being able to have your own children. And Nazi Germany said they looked to this law, which was later adopted by almost half the American states, as their model.
Yeah. It's scary. Well, I think we have time for some questions. They've texted me some questions here that have come in, and we'll go through them. You mentioned that many people were joining the Klan because there was a notion that everyone is joining the Klan, and if you didn't, you would be left out. What are mechanisms that allow for more individuals to rise against these unifications based on hate? Can you think of how people might resist this?
Well, I'll tell you something that they were effective at doing to make this happen. This wasn't just the speeches, but they handed out these little stickers, and the sticker was TWK, Trade with Klan. So if you were a merchant and you wanted to show that you were Klan approved, you would put one of these little stickers on your windows of your store. And the Ford auto dealership, used to run ads saying, our staff is 100% Americans and we sell to only 100% Americans. The opposition to the caller's question tried to shame them, as I mentioned earlier, with this doxing. And shaming them didn't really work. So I'm not sure shaming as a way to fight hate does work. In the end, they had to just take them on head on. Kansas finally became the first state after all these scandals happened in the 20s. This is what brought down the Klan. I haven't mentioned this, that they're at 6 million. Suddenly they're exposed through DC Stevens as being a bunch of complete sexual, predators, rapists, murderers. The head of the Klan in Oregon killed a woman. The head of the Klan in Colorado kidnapped a guy. I mean, there were just all these crimes they did. So that sort of helped crater.
Yeah.
My alternative theory, though, is that the Klan achieved most of its goals. That's why they cratered. They passed that immigration law of 1924. They got Jim Crow established in much of the North, and they got prohibition, which was one of the big things. They were anti-alcohol because they thought that's the way we would kill the immigrant, societies, pubs and dens and stuff. So shaming doesn't work to the question. It didn't work in this case. Maybe it works now. They had to just go after them with laws, as President Grant did. Passed 3 anti-Klan laws in the 70s, and they locked them up. They put 10,000 Klansmen in the 1870s in jail on these anti-Klan acts. So I don't think, I'm sorry to say this, I don't think appealing to our better angels, we'll just shame them. We'll just show them for what they are, always works.
Yeah, yeah. And it's a very chilling thought that maybe one of the reasons that they just kind of disappeared is that they got what they wanted.
Exactly.
That their ideas became mainstream enough for them to just kind of go home, once they.
No, that's exactly right. And I'm sorry to admit that. I mean, I sort of toy with that theory at the end of the book.
Yeah. The Klan also campaigned against Catholic schools to further their agenda. Can you tell us more about the state of educational and religious freedom in the 20s? Do you see any parallels with educational systems being targeted similarly today? How do we ensure that our education systems teach change and justice? Those are 3 separate questions there. So first, starting out, their campaign against Catholic schools, and what was the state of educational religious freedom in the 20s?
One of the things that startled me, and this is where I started my research. So I live in the Pacific Northwest, and I was going to do a book about the Klan in Oregon. Everyone thinks of Oregon as some woke state. Well,
oh no.
They not only had a Klan governor and a Klan mayor.
And Black people couldn't move there, right?
People could not. I'm glad you know that. When they became a territory, one of the first things they did was made it impossible for Blacks to own property.
Yeah.
Into Washington, where I live, they had to cross the Columbia. That's why we got our first Black settlement in Washington State, because they fled Oregon. But they're the only state in the nation to vote by popular vote to outlaw Catholic schools. They did this in the 1920s. It was later ruled unconstitutional. So to this narrow question, now, why did they outlaw Catholic schools? They weren't interested in, the First Amendment Establishment Clause saying we'll establish no religion. What they hated about Catholic schools is they were citizen breeding grounds for immigrants. Because Catholic schools were primarily there was a wave of Southern Italians coming in. They already had Irish. So Irish, Italians, and they thought, well, these Catholic schools, if we outlaw the schools, we'll sort of destroy. The same thought on prohibition. Outlaw alcohol, you get rid of the social lubricant that binds these people. So it's all about immigration. It wasn't about religion, well, only in the sense that they feared the Pope. So they voted to outlaw Catholic schools. Now, as to what's happening today, people forget, and you touched on it, I'm glad you did. In the First Amendment, it says we will not have a state religion. And when the state gets involved with religion, all kinds of problems and troubles and actual horror stories follow. Now, why do we not have a state religion? I also did a book about my own faith. I was raised a Catholic, and I walked through a pilgrimage trail in Europe. And one of the things that just not shocked me, but it opened my eyes to what I already sort of knew, was that all these European countries, state and religion were one and the same. The monarchs were all, and it was a horrible thing. So dissenters were executed. And so the first thing these Enlightenment era founders of the United States did in the very First Amendment was say, we're not going to have a state-run religion. Now, what I see happening today is a little bit opposite of the 20s, where they were afraid of immigrants and Catholics. Now, people are leaning more and more toward violating the First Amendment Establishment Clause. And having religious schools, seeing that 10 commandments have to be taught. So once you open that door to the 10 commandments have to be taught, well, what else? What other religions have to be taught? That's why they didn't establish a religion.
Yeah. So let's see. I think that one we may have covered. Okay, you shared a Simmons quote It wasn't until the newspapers began to attack the Klan that it really grew. And Congress gave us the best advertising they ever got. What advice do you have for journalists, laymen today to be able to share information about what's going on in a way that informs people about the perils and prevents recruitment? I guess the subtext of this is that we're living in a time when something like this is going on. I mean, that this is a time of people being misled or led into groups that are, that promote a notion of hate. But how I guess the thinking here is, again, what advice you have for journalists or laymen to be able to share information about what's going on in a way that informs them and prevents
I'll say
recruitment?
this is one of my conclusions. So, we live in an era right now where misinformation is rampant and is arguably destroying a lot of Western democracies. That toxic poison of misinformation can so easily get into the bloodstream of so many voters because it's chaos. There's no, people read just, totally false things and incorporate them as their own. One of the things that surprised me, which you asked earlier, in the 1920s, they had a misinformation network as well. We didn't invent it just now because of the internet. This Klansman, D.C. Stephenson, had his, they called it his poison squad. And what they would do,
the poison squad.
they would plant a rumor, a lie at dawn, and they would say, by the end of the day, everyone in Indiana will have known about it. And they had this sort of Klux brigade that passed it on, women in the Klan. And the rumor was usually something that, oh, a certain merchant is a Jew, so-and-so store is owned by Jews, or, oh, blacks are moving into this neighborhood. Indiana was very segregated and didn't segregate their schools until the 1960s. So they would say this prominent dentist in one case moved into a black neighborhood. So they had misinformation then. It's not like we didn't invent it. What I will say, and this is my conclusion, is that we have got to teach media literacy in high school. Not just civics, which has fallen by the wayside, but you can't let a kid graduate from American high school without being able to recognize BS from fact. Media literacy, so you can recognize it. And that will allow people to then expose the evils in society. But in a chaos thing where every statement has equal rights, people can't recognize. So I think you've got to teach media. A lot of schools are doing this now. I think you've got to teach that. Just give new citizens the tools to recognize crap from fact or propaganda from fact.
Well, that's a tall order, but it's like anytime any new media comes into the fore, there's a learning curve where people have to figure out, but a whole lot of damage can be done in between the time people become savvy about it and when they're not. Well, you kind of answered this, but I think it's important. How can con men and demagogues like him be constrained? Are there any moments in your research where you see that he could have been stopped other than Oberholtzer? I mean, was there some moment you thought, wow, okay, this could have been the end of him?
Yeah. What was the nexus point? I'll tell you when I think it was. I mentioned this briefly. Before the attack on this woman, this rape and this ultimately murder that did bring him down, I mentioned this. He attacked this woman. He attacked several women, but this one got publicity. Had they prosecuted them then, instead of using his buddies in the law enforcement, he would have been locked up. And he would have been locked up for a very long time because he'd committed a violent felony. And they chose not to. And, they were afraid of him, and he had people in, good lawyers, and he had people in the institutions. That was sort of the turning point. That's thereafter is when he started saying, I am the law.
And he had, well, what's interesting to me about him, I mean, he, lots of interesting things, but there are no whistleblower. I mean, there was no one who wanted to, was there anyone who wanted to take over from him? I mean, you people like that usually, like Roman emperors, there are all these people who want to take over from him.
Well, there was an interesting intra-clan fight, and I forgot to mention, while all this is going on, as evidence of how much mainstream power they had a march in Washington, D.C.
Oh, yeah.
And 50,000 people turned out and marched from the Capitol Dome down to the Treasury building in broad daylight. And the Washington Post and the New York Times were shocked because they interviewed them all, and they were like, "Oh yeah, I own a store in Pittsburgh. I have a so and so in Rochester, New York." They were mostly all Northerners, so they were really flexing their power. And again, I think journalists want to be seen as being on the popular side, being part of the majority sentiment. People didn't really want to be disruptors. They didn't want to challenge. So there were only a brave few, like I said. I mentioned this guy in Muncie who was later pardoned by Franklin Roosevelt and later became the mayor of Muncie. So that story actually turned out well. But he paid for it by being locked up. And most of them, it was sad. I mean, this was the golden age of newspapers. Every town had like 3 dailies.
Yeah.
In a town of any size. But you don't, and I read a million of these newspapers, and every day there's some big story about the Klan, but it largely wasn't negative.
Yeah.
It was Klan to stage fireworks show, Klan to have membership drive, Klan urges clamping down on blacks moving to so-and-so neighborhood, all these things. It was largely going along.
Well, I mean, maybe that's the role of the press in general. I mean, having come of age in the 70s, when people think of a sort of a golden age of investigative reporting and Woodward and Bernstein, and I have sort of an understanding about what the press is supposed to do and how they're supposed to act. And I have to say that I've been surprised and chagrined of late that they're not doing that in the same kind of way. So maybe that moment, that was a blip. Does this suggest that that's a blip that mostly, maybe it is the journalists are drawn from the same members of the community that exist, that they're writing about. So why should they be different? I guess. I don't know, for whatever reason, they were different in the 70s.
And again, with the golden age newspapers, they're all competing for readership. And the readership in these places was majority sentiment Klan. I mean, there's a reason why they voted for all this stuff. They were for it. I mean, there's a reason why they put a known Klansman in their governorship. They were for it. Now, it is interesting, like I said, that later you couldn't find a Klansman.
Yeah.
But here's the difference between today and now. If any public individual called a press conference and said, "I'm a proud member of the Klan," in Portland, these Klansmen stood there with the chief of police, the mayor, and all these ministers. I have a picture in the book. There they are proudly, they call a press conference and say, "I'm a proud member of the Klan, and here's the cops, and they're with me." If you did that today, you'd be
Yeah. So there has been progress.
No, on the surface, but the sentiment disguised, changed, morphed, perhaps softened, I like to think, is still there.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. I mean, we're coming to the close of this. We don't have any time for more questions, but I do want to give you a last word. What is the main takeaway from this? What do you hope for your this book?
Again, I want to thank everyone at RFK for helping me out here, and Bobby Kennedy. I came of age in the 70s too, and I just revered Bobby Kennedy, and to be a small part of this, linked to his legacy is wonderful. I guess the takeaway is, so I didn't know how this book was going to be received, but it's found a huge audience. It's sold really well, and that gives me some hope that in this point, and we talked about this, I'm glad we brought this up, we shouldn't be afraid of our history. We shouldn't be afraid. We learn from this. We're ultimately stronger if we can see the bad with the good. If you want a smiley button version of the history, you're never going to be a strong citizen.
Well, thank you very much. And I've enjoyed this, and
me too.
Hope to meet you in person someday.
I hope to meet you on a better note too.
Thank you. Wonderful book. Thank you.
Thank you.